Every morning, you crack an egg into a hot pan without giving it a second thought. Eggs feel so ordinary that we barely even register them as something produced by an animal. But pause for a moment and consider what you are actually looking at. An egg is a single cell designed to develop into a living creature with nearly everything that animal needs to grow already sealed inside its fragile shell. And this is where the story becomes strange. A modern laying hen produces roughly 300 eggs every year. Her wild ancestor laid only around 10 to 20. Nobody planned that transformation from the beginning, yet this almost unbelievable number is the main reason your breakfast looks the way it does today. Keep that number in the back of your mind, because it will become important before this story ends. The real question is much bigger than it first appears. There are approximately 10,000 species of birds on Earth, along with countless reptiles, fish, amphibians, and insects that also reproduce by laying eggs. Humans consume more than 1.2 trillion chicken eggs every year, while the overwhelming majority of all those other eggs never come anywhere near our plates. The chicken did not conquer the breakfast table because its egg was uniquely delicious or biologically extraordinary. It won because of a remarkable chain of accidents hidden inside its biology, none of which had much to do with flavor. To understand how that happened, we first need to examine the eggs humans are already willing to eat and discover exactly where our tolerance begins to crack. Let's start with one of the easiest examples: quail eggs. These tiny, speckled eggs are sold in cans, jars, markets, and restaurants across much of the world. People usually treat them like miniature chicken eggs, and biologically, that comparison is surprisingly accurate. They come from a closely related bird, share the same fundamental structure, and differ mainly in size. Once a culture accepts the egg of one bird, the egg of a similar bird can slip onto the menu with almost no resistance. Duck eggs pass through the same invisible gate. Their yolks are richer and their shells are thicker, but they still resemble chicken eggs closely enough that most people do not hesitate before eating them. Then the story crosses into territory that many people find far more uncomfortable. In the Philippines, Vietnam, and Cambodia, one of the most recognizable street foods is balut. It is a fertilized duck egg that has been incubated for roughly 2 or 3 weeks, then boiled and eaten while the partially developed embryo remains inside. Millions of people eat it without fear, hesitation, or disgust. For someone raised around a conventional Western breakfast table, however, that description alone can trigger an immediate and deeply physical feeling of revulsion. Yet structurally, balut is still the same kind of egg you may have eaten this morning. The only meaningful difference is that its development was allowed to continue for several more days before being stopped. This brings us to an important name in the science of disgust. Psychologist Paul Rosine has studied this reaction for decades and uncovered something deeply revealing. Disgust is rarely determined by danger alone. Most disgust responses are learned associations rather than automatic biological defenses. Balut does not disgust unfamiliar diners because it is inherently more dangerous than a regular chicken egg. It disgusts them because they did not grow up seeing it as food, while people who did may feel absolutely nothing unusual when eating it. Remember that distinction because it contains half of the answer we are looking for. Now let's move even farther away from the familiar world of birds and look at fish eggs. This is where the entire pattern begins to fall apart, because people eat them constantly, not as some obscure or shocking curiosity. Sturgeon caviar can sell for thousands of dollars per kilogram, and is treated as one of the most luxurious foods on Earth. Salmon roe appears in sushi restaurants around the world, alongside the eggs of herring, flying fish, and even cod. These foods prove that evolutionary distance was never the true barrier. Fish are biologically far removed from mammals, yet their eggs can still sit on silver spoons in the world's most expensive restaurants. So, if evolutionary distance does not explain our choices, and physical danger does not explain them either, what actually determines which eggs we eat? To answer that question, we need to enter one of the darkest chapters in this entire story, a disaster that most people have never heard about. During the 19th century, passenger pigeons existed in North America in numbers so enormous that their migrating flocks could darken the sky. There were billions of them, and their eggs were collected by the wagon load before being sold cheaply in markets alongside the birds themselves. What seemed like an endless natural resource disappeared with terrifying speed. After only a few decades of industrial hunting and uncontrolled egg harvesting, the entire passenger pigeon population collapsed. The last known passenger pigeon, a bird named Martha, died in captivity in 1914. Her death marked the end of a species that humans had once believed could never possibly run out. That catastrophe, combined with the near extinction of several other bird species targeted by the same reckless harvesting, directly contributed to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. The law made it illegal in the United States to collect the eggs of nearly any protected wild bird without federal permission. Similar protections now exist across much of the world. As a result, an enormous category of eggs, from robins and songbirds to hawks and other birds of prey, remains absent from our menus. Those eggs did not disappear from the dinner table because people suddenly found them disgusting. They disappeared because the last time humans treated wild eggs like an unlimited source of casual food, an entire species vanished within the span of a single human lifetime. The same grim pattern later repeated itself with reptiles. Sea turtle eggs were once widely eaten throughout Central America and Southeast Asia, where they were collected directly from nesting beaches. For generations, this practice was regarded as completely ordinary. But as harvesting intensified, sea turtle populations began falling at an alarming rate. Today, nearly every species of sea turtle is threatened or endangered, and collecting their eggs is illegal across most of the planet. Once again, a familiar food did not vanish because human taste suddenly changed. It was pushed off the menu by conservation laws written after the damage had already become impossible to ignore. Northern Australia, however, offers a revealing exception to this pattern. Saltwater crocodile eggs can still be legally collected there under strictly controlled quotas. According to people who have tasted them, their flavor resembles a rich duck egg far more than anything strange or unmistakably reptilian. The egg itself was never the real obstacle. Access, scarcity, and regulation were the forces that decided whether it would ever reach a plate. But among all the animals on this list, there is one remarkable case in which nature fought back and actually won. Frog eggs, the translucent clusters of jelly floating in ponds and wetlands, are almost never eaten anywhere in the world. This time, the reason is not cultural discomfort, government regulation, or simple unfamiliarity. There is a genuine biological explanation. Most frog and toad eggs consist largely of water and gelatinous material, offering very little in terms of calories or nutritional value. Some species go even further by coating their eggs with mild toxins specifically designed to discourage predators from swallowing them. Evolution essentially built a protective barrier against the exact behavior we are describing. It is one of the rare examples in this entire story where an animal developed an effective defense for its eggs and successfully kept them off the human menu. Insects also lay eggs, although most people rarely think of them as food. In central Mexico, ant eggs and larvae are carefully harvested from the roots of agave plants and sold under the name escamoles. They can be remarkably expensive, are considered a prized delicacy, and have been eaten in the region since long before the rise of the Aztec Empire. Yet outside that part of the world, most people have never even heard of them. That is not because escamoles are dangerous, poisonous, or unsuitable for human consumption. They remained unfamiliar because the culinary tradition surrounding them never expanded across the world in the way chicken farming eventually did. And that word, expanded, brings us much closer to the real answer. Layered on top of biology, availability, and tradition are religious rules that have shaped human diets for thousands of years. Kosher dietary laws permit eggs only from kosher birds and reject an egg entirely if a blood spot is found inside it. Under traditional Jewish law, that spot can be interpreted as evidence of developing life. Islamic dietary traditions include comparable restrictions that also influence which animals and animal products are considered acceptable to eat. These rules were established thousands of years before anyone understood embryos, cells, or modern reproductive biology. Yet they continue to operate quietly in the background, helping determine which products eventually appear on supermarket shelves. Then there is perhaps the simplest and most powerful influence of all: childhood conditioning. Research into food neophobia suggests that the easiest window for accepting unfamiliar foods begins narrowing dramatically at around 2 or 3 years of age. A child raised in a culture where balut or escamoles are ordinary foods can grow into an adult who feels no discomfort while eating them. To that person, these dishes may feel as familiar and harmless as scrambled eggs or toast. But a child who has only ever seen eggs as clean, smooth objects inside pale shells may grow into an adult who recoils at the sight of a partially developed duck embryo. No one is born feeling disgust toward a fertilized egg. That reaction is taught gradually through family habits, cultural expectations, facial expressions, and repeated exposure. Once the boundary settles into the mind, removing it can be surprisingly difficult. What feels like an instinctive warning from the body is often nothing more than a lesson absorbed so early that we no longer remember learning it. And that finally brings us back to the number you were asked to remember at the beginning. Because the real answer has very little to do with taste, nutrition, or even the egg itself. The real answer is rooted in the almost unnatural level of productivity that humans managed to breed into the modern chicken. A wild bird typically lays only 10 to 20 eggs per year, usually during a limited nesting season. Modern laying hens, descended from the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia, can produce approximately 300 eggs every year. That number is not remotely natural. No other domesticated egg-laying animal on Earth comes close to matching it at the same scale, price, and consistency. Even the most productive ducks generally lay somewhere between 150 and 200 eggs per year. Quail can approach the chicken's output, but each of their eggs is only a fraction of the size. Once chickens began producing enormous quantities of eggs reliably, cheaply, and with relatively little risk, there was no longer any economic reason to industrialize the eggs of another animal. The market did not select the egg with the finest flavor. It selected the animal capable of producing the greatest number of usable eggs at the lowest possible cost. After that decision was made, entire food cultures gradually formed around the winner. Recipes were created around chicken eggs. Farms, transportation networks, packaging systems, restaurants, and supermarkets were all built to handle them. With every passing generation, the chicken egg became more familiar, while nearly every alternative began to seem increasingly strange. Then, another important factor entered the picture: salmonella. After more than a century of improved sanitation, controlled farming, testing, refrigeration, and vaccination, chicken eggs became one of the most heavily monitored animal products on the planet. Wild reptile and amphibian eggs can carry far less predictable risks, not necessarily because those eggs are inherently more dangerous, but because humans never spent a century constructing an enormous safety system around them. There are no global supply chains, standardized farms, inspection programs, or refrigerated supermarket aisles designed specifically for frog, turtle, or crocodile eggs. So the honest answer is that almost any egg on Earth could technically be eaten under the right conditions. A chicken egg is not automatically safer, more nutritious, or more delicious than the egg of a duck, quail, or even a crocodile. What ultimately shaped the human menu was several thousand years of selective breeding focused on one particular species of jungle fowl. That biological transformation was then reinforced by whatever foods each culture taught its children to recognize as normal. That is essentially the entire explanation. The line separating an ordinary breakfast from something considered disgusting was not drawn by biology. It was drawn by whichever animal your ancestors happened to domesticate first. Once that animal began producing food reliably, culture built walls around the choice and treated everything outside them as unfamiliar. Every generation since then has inherited the same invisible boundary without ever stopping to ask who created it or why it exists at all.